I stood in the middle of the grand wedding hall, my champagne glass cold in my hand. Laughter and music filled the air, but I felt like I was somewhere else, watching everything from a distance. My father sat at the head table beaming beside his new wife. She looked perfect. Too perfect. The kind of perfection that felt rehearsed, like a role she had been preparing for long before my mother was even gone. The clinking of glasses brought me back to reality. It was time for the toasts. One by one, people stood up saying sweet things about love and second chances. My father laughed, his voice full of joy, as if the past had never existed, as if my mother had never existed. Then, all eyes turned to me. Someone nudged my arm and my father raised his glass, waiting. I knew what they expected, something polite, something nice, a few words to welcome his new wife into our family. But the words wouldn't come. How could they? I set my glass down. Silence. My father's smile faded. His eyes darkened, and the warmth in them disappeared in an instant. "Well?" he said, his voice sharp. I swallowed hard but said nothing. Whispers spread through the crowd. A few guests exchanged awkward glances, shifting in their seats. My father's grip tightened around his glass. "This is a celebration," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You could at least be respectful." I met his gaze, my heart pounding. Respectful? Had he been respectful when he moved on so quickly? When he barely spoke about my mother anymore? When he acted like she was just a distant memory instead of the woman who had built a life with him? My silence was louder than any words I could have said, and that silence made him furious. His face twisted with anger, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You're a disgrace," he hissed. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but he didn't care. His focus was on me, on the daughter who refused to play along with his perfect new life. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything I was holding back. But instead, I stood still, staring at the man I no longer recognized. And deep inside my purse, hidden from everyone, was the letter that would change everything. A year. That's all it took for my father to erase my mother from his life. 1 year. For me, it still felt like yesterday. I could still hear her voice, still smell her perfume lingering in the old sweaters she used to wear. Sometimes, I'd wake up expecting to hear her in the kitchen humming while she made tea. But then reality would hit me like a punch to the chest. She was gone. And now, here I was, standing at my father's wedding, watching him hold another woman's hand like my mother had never even existed. I wanted to scream at him. How could he move on so quickly? How could he smile like that, like he hadn't spent years loving my mother? I had spent the past year drowning in grief, barely holding myself together. And him? He was celebrating. He had a new life, a new love, a new wife. I wasn't stupid. I had seen the signs long before my mother passed. The late-night phone calls, the sudden business trips, the way he stopped looking at my mother the way he used to. Maybe she saw it too, but she never said a word. Maybe she thought she had more time, but she didn't. And now my father stood in front of everyone, acting as if none of it mattered. As if my mother had just been a chapter in his life instead of his whole story. I could hear the guests whispering about me, wondering why I wasn't smiling, why I hadn't given a toast. They didn't understand. They never would. Because while they were here to celebrate a new beginning, I was still stuck in the past, holding on to the pieces of a life that had been ripped away from me. I glanced at my father. He looked happy. Maybe even happier than I had ever seen him before. And that hurt more than anything, because if he could move on so easily, then maybe, just maybe, he had never really loved her at all. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Instead, I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the envelope hidden inside. My mother's last letter. I hadn't opened it yet. I was scared of what it might say. But one thing was certain. Whatever was inside would change everything. The letter sat in my purse, untouched, but I felt its weight as if it were made of stone. My mother's final words, written just for me. I had carried it everywhere since the day I found it, tucked inside one of her old books. At first, I told myself I wasn't ready to read it. Then I convinced myself that maybe I didn't need to. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what it might say. Scared that it would hurt more than I could handle. I had already lost her. What if this letter was her goodbye? What if it was full of words I wasn't ready to hear? But tonight, standing in the middle of my father's wedding, watching him laugh with his new wife, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about truth, about the things left unsaid. I slipped my hand into my purse, my fingers brushing against the worn edges of the envelope. My mother's handwriting was on the front, my name written in the way only she could write it, gentle but certain. A knot formed in my stomach. I had spent a whole year avoiding this moment, but now I knew. It was time. Taking a deep breath, I turned away from the crowd and walked toward a quiet corner of the hall. My hands trembled as I pulled out the letter. The paper was slightly yellowed, the ink slightly smudged. She must have written it before she got too sick, before she knew there wouldn't be more time. For a moment I hesitated. Once I read this, I couldn't unread it. Whatever was inside would become part of me, something I'd have to carry forever. But maybe that was the point. Maybe my mother had left this for me so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of her loss alone. The sound of laughter echoed behind me, my father's voice warm and full of joy. He had moved on. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew what my mother had left behind. With a deep breath, I slid my finger under the seal and carefully opened the envelope. And as I unfolded the paper, my heart pounded, knowing that whatever was written inside would change everything. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. The paper inside was soft, almost fragile, as if time itself had been holding it together. My mother's handwriting stretched across the page, delicate yet unsteady, like she had written it in a hurry, or with hands that no longer had their usual strength. I took a deep breath and began to read. "My love," she began. The words hit me instantly. She always called me that. Even when I was little, even when I was stubborn and angry, she never stopped saying it. I blinked hard and forced myself to keep reading. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you're ready to know the truth. The truth? My stomach twisted. What truth? I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid of how it would change you. Afraid of how it would break your heart. But I can't leave this world without making sure you know everything, because you deserve to know. I gripped the letter tighter, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own breath. Your father. He wasn't faithful to me. The air left my lungs. He met her long before I was gone, before I even got sick. I knew. I always knew. I saw the late-night messages, the whispered phone calls, the way he stopped looking at me the way he used to. But I stayed. I stayed because I loved you more than I hated him. The walls of the wedding hall felt like they were closing in. My father's laughter echoed somewhere in the distance, but it felt miles away. I wanted to leave him. I wanted to take you and go far, far away. But by the time I gathered the courage, it was too late. The illness had already taken hold of me. And so I stayed, watching him prepare for a life without me before I was even gone. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands tightening around the letter as tears blurred the ink. I don't tell you this to hurt you. I tell you this so you know you were never the reason I stayed. You were the reason I survived. And now, my love, you don't have to stay. You don't have to hold on to someone who let go of us long before he was supposed to. I swallowed back a sob. I had spent so long wondering why my father had moved on so quickly, why he had erased my mother's memory as if she never existed. And now I knew. He hadn't lost her. He had already left her. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest as if I could hold on to my mother one last time. Then, slowly, I lifted my head and looked back at the reception. At the man who had betrayed her. At the man who had called me a disgrace, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. The words on the page blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My mother had known. She had known all along. My father hadn't waited. He hadn't mourned. He hadn't even had the decency to pretend. While I had been holding my mother's hand through her worst days, while she had been fighting for every last breath, he had already moved on. His love had already shifted to someone else. And my mother, she had stayed silent for me. I gripped the letter tightly, my nails digging into the paper. My mother must have spent so many nights lying awake, knowing that the man she had loved had already checked out of their marriage, knowing that while she was fading, he was building a new life with someone else. And still she stayed. She smiled for me. She hid her pain so I wouldn't have to carry it. I thought back to those days when she would sit by the window staring out at nothing, lost in her own world. I used to think she was just tired, that the illness was draining her. But now I realized it was something else. It was heartbreak. And my father. He had played the role of the grieving husband so well. He had stood by her bedside, had whispered fake reassurances, had probably even held her hand when he knew his heart belonged to another woman. How could he do that? How could he be so cruel? I clenched my jaw, my whole body shaking, and now here he was, standing in the middle of this grand wedding hall, acting like he was some man who had overcome loss and found happiness again, acting like he was someone to be admired. And everyone believed him. But I knew the truth now. I glanced around the room. Guests were laughing, glasses clinking, completely unaware of the lies that surrounded them. My father's new wife sat beside him, her smile bright, her hand resting on his like she belonged there. But she didn't. She never had. I wanted to scream, to make everyone hear what I had just read, to expose him in front of every single person here. But my mother's words held me back. I don't tell you this to hurt you. I tell you this so you know you don't have to stay. That was it, wasn't it? I didn't have to carry this pain like she did. I didn't have to pretend like nothing had happened. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the letter. My father had lied. He had betrayed my mother, our family, and me. But I wasn't going to be silent like she had. Not anymore. I turned toward the center of the room, my heart pounding, knowing exactly what I was about to do. It was time to tell the truth. My heart pounded as I walked back into the wedding hall. The chandeliers sparkled above me, the music played softly, and the guests laughed over half-finished glasses of champagne. My father sat at the head table, his new wife beside him, their fingers intertwined. He looked so comfortable, so at peace, as if he had nothing to hide. But I knew the truth now, and I wasn't going to be silent. I reached for my champagne glass, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. Tapping my fork against the rim, I waited as the chatter died down. One by one, heads turned toward me. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, probably expecting a forced, polite toast. I cleared my throat, lifted my glass, and spoke. To love, I began, my voice strong. To devotion. To the kind of love that never wavers, even when times get hard. The kind of love that stays loyal, even when it's not easy. I saw my father shift in his seat. He knew something was coming. I took a breath, forcing myself to look him in the eyes. So, tonight I want to raise my glass. Not to this marriage, not to new beginnings, but to my mother, the woman who stayed faithful until the very end, even when she knew she wasn't being given the same in return. The room went completely silent. Someone coughed awkwardly. A few guests exchanged confused glances. My father's new wife froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. But my father? His face turned pale, his smile disappearing in an instant. I wasn't done. She knew, I continued, my voice sharp. She knew about the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the trips that weren't really for business. She knew long before she got sick. And yet she stayed. For me. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few people gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "What is she talking about?" My father stood abruptly. "Enough." His voice was low, angry, but I wasn't afraid. "No," I shot back. "You don't get to silence me like you silenced her. You stood by her bedside, pretending to be the devoted husband while planning a future with someone else. And now you expect me to sit here and celebrate? To smile and pretend she never existed?" He took a step toward me, his jaw clenched. "This is not the time or place." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, but it was the time and place for your lies, wasn't it?" The guests sat frozen, watching the scene unfold like a play they hadn't expected to see. My father's new wife looked down, her face red with shame. She knew too. She had always known. I took one last look at my father, the man I had once admired, the man I no longer recognized. Then I lifted my glass higher and whispered, "To my mother." And with that, I set the glass down and walked away. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the gasps came, sharp, sudden, like a wave crashing over the room. Whispers followed, hushed but urgent, spreading from table to table. I could see people leaning in, murmuring to each other, eyes darting between me and my father. Some guests looked shocked, others uncomfortable, unsure if they should stay quiet or react. My father's new wife turned pale. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She glanced at my father, searching for reassurance, but he had nothing to give her. His face was red with rage, his hands clenched at his sides. "This is nonsense," he spat, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is nothing but a bitter, childish outburst." But no one was looking at me with judgment. They were looking at him. "I loved your mother," he continued, his voice rising. "I did everything for her, and now you stand here humiliating me on the most important day of my life." A dry, bitter laugh escaped my lips. "The most important day of your life? What about hers? The woman you betrayed? The woman you left long before she was even gone?" The whispers grew louder. People were piecing it together now. They saw his reaction, his anger, his desperation, and they knew. "Is it true?" someone asked from the crowd. An older man, one of my father's longtime friends. He looked at him with something close to disgust. My father scoffed. "Of course not." But his voice wasn't as strong as before. More whispers, more doubt. His new wife finally found her voice. "Tell them it's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father turned to her, his face twisted in frustration. "You know what she's doing. She's twisting things, trying to make me look like the villain." I tilted my head. "Then say it. Say you were never with her before Mom got sick. Look at your wife, the woman you married today, and swear to her in front of everyone that you were faithful." Silence. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. And that was it. That was all anyone needed to see. More murmurs. Someone shook their head. A woman at the back of the room whispered, "Disgusting." His new wife inhaled sharply, realization hitting her all at once. She pulled her hand away from his. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Then, without another word, she stood and walked away. My father turned back to me, eyes blazing. "You think this makes you righteous? You think this makes you better than me?" I exhaled, my anger fading into something calmer, something lighter. "No," I said. "It just makes me free." I turned my back to him, hearing more chairs scrape, more guests whispering. The perfect image he had tried to create had shattered, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel trapped in his shadow. I felt free. I stood there for a moment looking at the man who was supposed to be my father. His face was red with anger, his hands shaking at his sides. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of his reaction. I wasn't waiting for his approval. I wasn't hoping he would say something that would make it all better. Because I finally understood, nothing could. He had made his choices. He had betrayed my mother, lied to me, and built a life on secrets. And now those secrets were out in the open, laid bare for everyone to see. The guests whispered, their faces filled with shock and disgust. His new wife had already walked away, realizing the truth too late, and he just stood there, exposed. But I didn't feel sorry for him. I took a deep breath, turned my back on him, and walked toward the exit. I wasn't just leaving the wedding, I was leaving him. With every step, I felt lighter, as if I had been carrying a weight for years without realizing it, a weight made of pain, disappointment, and unspoken words. I had spent so long wishing things were different, wishing he was the father I needed him to be. But that wish had died the moment I read my mother's letter. She had stayed silent for my sake. She had carried the weight of his betrayal so I wouldn't have to. But now, I was choosing something different. I was choosing to walk away. I reached the doors and hesitated, my fingers resting against the cool metal. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve better." And she was right. I did. I deserved love that was honest. I deserved family that didn't make me feel like an outsider. I deserved to be free of him, of his lies, of the way he had erased my mother as if she had never mattered. I pushed the doors open and stepped outside. The night air hit my skin, fresh and cool, washing away the last traces of the past. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something better. I was walking toward myself.